Hello, Mr. Chung. I hope you're enjoying your day. In this video, I will be talking about the civil rights movement after World War II. The civil rights movement was a movement that pushed for the end of racial discrimination, specifically segregation and voting rights. This fight against racial discrimination in America did not just begin after World War II. It began ever since the start of America. Even after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, the issue of racial discrimination was not over. During Reconstruction after the Civil War, one of the main goals of America was to help promote African American rights. They made great progress by passing the 13th through 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, promised equal protection under law for all races, and gave African Americans the right to vote. However, these amendments did not make a complete and sure change in America. Many pro-slavery Southerners wanted to maintain their old way life of slavery and domination over African Americans. Jim Crow laws were made, which were laws that were allowed because of loopholes in the 14th and 15th Amendments. This made it so that racial discrimination could technically be allowed through unequal segregation and the limiting of African American voters. Similar to how Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs had to come to an end because of funding, the Reconstruction progress came to an end as well because the banks and the economy started to fail. Because of this, the issue of legal racial discrimination in America wasn't fixed, and this is what the civil rights movement sought to change. The first issue that the civil rights movement sought to fix was segregation. So there is two types of segregation. De jure segregation is segregation enforced by the law. An example of this would be segregation in buses. In the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the court ruled that segregation on buses, for example, was constitutional because both parties, the white and the black, were separate, but they were equal, which, as we know, was not true. De facto segregation was segregation enforced by societal or cultural norms. An example of this would be in the 1919 Chicago race riot, where there was a white-only beach, not by law, but by custom. And when an African-American man swam there, it started the race riots. Because the white people were angry that the African-American man went in the white-only beach. One way World War II and helped the civil rights movement was that it made America accountable for their actions of discrimination. This was because it would seem hypocritical for America to be fighting for democracy across the world and neglect their own citizens who are being discriminated in their own country. While they would fight for freedom across the world, they would also fight for equality within their home. Another thing that helped more Americans push for the civil rights movement was sports, and more specifically, Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first African-American man to join Major League Baseball. Even though he faced a lot of challenges through racial discrimination, he worked hard and pushed through, and this helped him, as well as minorities, receive more respect from society. Now sports are racially integrated, and we can see this that 3/4 of the NBA are African-Americans. That was how racial discrimination within sports started to end. Next, the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education is what led to segregation within schools to end. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation within public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment rights of equal protection under the law for all races. Next was the issue of segregation on buses. When Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, was arrested for not giving up her seat on a segregated bus, it sparked the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was important not only because it brought a lot of change, but it also showed the power of peaceful protest. The Montgomery bus boycott was led by Martin Luther King Jr. The organization behind it was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. His principles of peaceful protest were inspired by Gandhi, Thoreau from the Transcendentalist movement, as well as his Christian values. He organized and encouraged people to boycott in Montgomery, where many people would choose not to take the bus and would walk instead. After a year of protesting, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional because they were inherently unequal. This reversed the ruling from the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Similar to how the South had created Jim Crow laws even after the 14th Amendment, many people and businesses still practiced segregation even after it was deemed unconstitutional. Martin Luther led another peaceful protest in Birmingham. Here, police used fire hoses and dogs to break up the protest, even though it was peaceful. The brutal actions of the police led the movement to get more attention and led the federal government to start to discuss the passing of a civil rights bill. Martin then led another peaceful protest on the Washington Monument, known as the March on Washington. He did this in order to pressure the government to pass the civil rights bill. This was where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. After the President JFK, who was a strong supporter of the civil rights movement, was assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, pushed for the passing of the Civil Rights Bill. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. The act banned segregation in public. It gave the government the power to desegregate their schools, and it also allowed those who violated the civil rights to be punished. This last part I just mentioned sort of reversed the ruling from the court case of United States versus Cruikshank, which made it so that the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection under the law, will only be applied when someone was discriminated by a state, not by a person, which in the past had empowered the KKK, a group that would intimidate and harm African Americans to prevent them from voting. The act also made it so that you couldn't discriminate someone in employment because of their sex, nationality, or race. As I had said before, the Jim Crow laws had affected segregation as well as voting rights. And now that the civil rights movement had taken care of segregation, they focused on fixing the issue of voting rights. Before this, the voting of the African Americans had been limited through literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation. And once again, the thing that led to change taking place was peaceful protests. One way people had protested was to work through the intimidation and help African Americans to register for voting. Another protesting event that caused great attention was known as Bloody Sunday. In Selma, Alabama, peaceful protesters were attacked by state troopers. The brutal actions of the state troopers were broadcasted in the media and got a lot of attention. This led the President Lyndon B. Johnson to speak out against these voting laws and eventually for Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and gave the federal government the power to oversee voting registrations and elections in order to reduce intimidation and discrimination that would affect the voting. Still, just like during Reconstruction, the passing of these laws did not fully fix the issue of racial discrimination, and it did not fully satisfy the needs of the minorities during the time. Soon after the Voting Rights Bill was passed, a race riot started in LA. This time, however, it was started by the African Americans because of police brutality that led to the death of an African American man, as well as the poverty that they experienced. This was similar to the riots that happened all over America this past year after George Floyd had died. We can see that it was African Americans themselves that were starting the riots rather than the people who opposed them. For example, the 1919 Chicago race riot that I mentioned earlier. Because of these violent riots, the civil rights movement began to lose traction because more white people were afraid. There were also more leaders and organizations who took a militant approach to the protest rather than the peaceful approach that Martin Luther had used. An example of one of these leaders was Malcolm X. Unlike Martin Luther, who grew up in a supportive Christian home, Malcolm grew up without a father and even became a convict. He even reformed his life and was converted to Islam. He believed that blacks were more superior to whites and that they deserved their own independent nation. His influence led to the Black Power movement. Supporters of the Black Power movement believed that there was no need to integrate for blacks and whites. All that was needed was economic equality. This shows us another reason why the civil rights movement lost traction, because the Black Power movement was essentially pushing everyone else who was not African American away. This is the roots of the Black Power movement that we see today. Malcolm X and Black Power were heavily influenced by the Back to Africa movement during the Roaring Twenties. The Back to Africa movement was basically black nationalism. They believed that African Americans should just leave America and make their own nation in Africa since no one liked them in America anyways. They also believed that they were superior to whites. Another organization that took a more militant approach to civil rights was the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party formed a militia that would attack only when they would see police brutality happening. Once again, the civil rights movement lost traction because it moved away from the peaceful Christian values to more militant and violent approaches. I'm sure from the video, you could clearly see my preference on peaceful or violent protesting, but I'll explain more why. In Matthew 5:39, Jesus tells us, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. In Romans 12:19 through 20, Jesus tells us not to take revenge. And it later says, if we treat our enemies with kindness, it's like heaping hot coals on his head. Throughout the civil rights movement, we can see that when peaceful protesters were met with violence and they didn't show violence back, it led to change happening. Because of this, we can see that the Christian values of the civil rights movement were more effective. In addition to the civil rights movement losing traction in society, the great reforms that were taking place in the government stopped after the end of Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. This was similar to how the progress of the Great Society policies had ended with Lyndon B. Johnson's end. Still, there were a lot of great changes that happened in America because of the civil rights movement. There was less poverty in the African American community. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African American judge in the Supreme Court. The government continued to push for the desegregation of schools through busing, which made quotas for different ethnicities. Here we can see the power of democracy once again and the importance of the First Amendment rights to protest in order to make change in the government. It also shows us that the way to fix problems, discrimination for example, is not through laws, it's not through the power of the government. It's by fixing the issue of the human condition in the heart. This can't be done by us mere humans, but it can only be done through Jesus, who has the power to change our hearts and save us from sin.